everybody. In this video, we will be focusing on the Cappadocians and the councils of Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon. All right, so up on the screen, I have an icon of the Cappadocians. All right, here we have Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Macrina. All right, so how do all these folks know each other? What's the relationship? Macrina, Basil, and Gregory of Nyssa were siblings. There was actually 9 children total in that family. Their parents were very, very devout. Their father was a professor of rhetoric, and their grandmother, Macrina the Elder, was a canonized saint. All right, Gregory of Nazianzus, also known as Gregory the Theologian, was their friend. The Cappadocians are really important figures in this era of like both religious doctrine, religious life, including monasticism, charitable works, hymn writing, all of that. So let me talk a little bit about these folks and what they did. We'll start here with Basil the Great. He was a well-trained theologian who gave up prestige for a life devoted to Christ. Okay, he and his good friend Gregory of Nazianzus founded a monastic community similar to that of his sister Macrina. He is largely considered the father of Eastern monasticism, where all Eastern legislation regarding monastic life is based on his teachings. And if you remember from an earlier visit, I said that he had actually visited Pachomius to see how he'd run his communities. All right, so there's lots of connections here. So on the outskirts of Caesarea, he and Gregory created a complex called New City, which was designed to help those in need. His monks provided services, and he was quite good at fundraising as well. All right, so that's sort of him in a brief nutshell. And then his younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa, he's actually quite unlike his 2 older siblings. He was well-educated, but not to the degree that Basil had been. And he did not kind of have the aspirations that Basil did either. He married, he had children, but then after his wife died, he took on the monastic life, though his brother actually forced him to be a bishop. Basil sort of had a habit of doing that, actually. But despite all of this, he became an ardent defender of Nicene Christianity, and he attended the Council of Constantinople. He even became an advisor to Emperor Theodosius. Okay. And then we have Gregory of Nazianzus. All right, he was the son of the bishop of Nazianzus, also named Gregory. There's a lot of Gregorys in this story. All right, he came from an all-around really devout family as well. Gregory, both of his parents, his brother, his sister, and his cousin all became canonized saints. All right. He studied in Athens with Basil and Emperor Julian, all right, Julian the Apostate, if you remember me talking about him, all right, and he actually declined to become a member of Julian's court. Gregory was physically forced to be a priest by his father. Then he ran away, and then returning, he gave a very, very moving sermon saying, "I have been overcome and I confess my defeat. It is difficult to practice obedience, but it is even more difficult to practice leadership." I love that quote, and I think it resonates with a lot of folks who are going into the ministry. All right, Basil made him a bishop against his will, and Gregory was so mad at that, so he was ordained against his will and then made a bishop against his will. In fact, he was so angry about that the two were never reconciled. All right. He fought against Arianism, and when Theodosius became emperor, Theodosius named Gregory bishop of Constantinople, which he also didn't want that, all right, and he quickly resigned. All right, he is one of the few people that hold the theologian in the title of the theologian in the church. All right, and then last up we have Macrina. All right, at the age of 12, her parents arranged a marriage for her. When her fiance died, she refused to marry anyone and devoted her life to Christ. All right, so she actually created sort of a monastic community right in her home. All right, she and her mother, along with a number of women, withdrew from society to live this life of contemplation. And she is the one who encouraged her brother Basil to really take up the monastic life. All right, she was known during her lifetime simply as the teacher because she had a lot of influence on the other Cappadocians. All right, so that's sort of the four of them in a nutshell, and they were really influential. Actually, in here, let's talk a little bit about them and the Trinity. All right, so during their lifetime, there was debate about kind of the nature of the Trinity. All right, there had been two different terms to describe the substance of God and Jesus during their lifetime. All right, ousia and hypostasis. Gregory of Nazianzus suggested a clarification on this term. The Trinity, he said, was three persons in one substance. All right, that'll probably sound familiar to you. Remember, this is actually very, very similar to what Tertullian had said a century earlier. Okay, and theologically, the Cappadocians affirmed the full humanity of Jesus, and they addressed the question of whether or not the Holy Spirit was fully divine. Okay, Basil embraced the idea that the Holy Spirit was the third person of the Trinity, though he actually refrained from calling the Holy Spirit God. Gregory of Nazianzus, though, did refer to the Holy Spirit as God. Okay, so we are looking towards another ecumenical conflict here. All right, specifically, we are looking towards the Council of Constantinople. So let's talk a little bit about how we get there. Remember, leading up to the Council of Nicaea, there is a great theological debate that leads to this council. We have theological debate amongst the church, again, leading to Constantinople. Okay, so behind this is the conflict between kind of the church in Antioch and the church in Alexandria. Remember, these are both very powerful bishopships during this time. Okay, all right. So these two kind of areas of Christianity had always had distinct worship and theological styles. Okay, and by the 4th century, they were in conflict about the nature of Jesus. The Alexandrians tended to be more influenced by Plato. Remember, like Origen lived in Alexandria, while the folks in Antioch tended to be more influenced by Aristotle and Jewish theological traditions. Okay, so here's a quote from your book to kind of sums it up well. The Antiochians were firmly committed to the doctrine of Jesus Christ having two natures, maintained that he had a complete human nature, which changed, and a complete divine nature, or the Logos, which did not. On the other hand, the Alexandrians were just as strongly committed to the doctrine that the Logos was joined to the flesh of Jesus Christ in a complete union in one divine person. All right, so this conflict leads to the Council of Constantinople in 381. It is Emperor Theodosius who calls this council, and it's mostly attended by Eastern bishops. At this council, the Holy Spirit was declared the third person of the Trinity, equal with the Father and the Son. The Patriarch of Constantinople was given precedence over all other bishops besides the Bishop of Rome. Thus begins this long political tension between the Pope and the bishop in Constantinople. Alexandria was particularly upset about the elevation of Constantinople because this was such an influential church. Okay. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about the Council of Ephesus, which is going to be the next big council. All right. As Gonzalez puts it, the next episode of Christological controversies was precipitated by Nestorius, who became the bishop of Constantinople in 428. All right, so Nestorius thought it was inappropriate to call the Virgin Mary the Theotokos, or God-bearer. Some of this was theological, some of this was likely his religious and political enemies exaggerating his position, and this may have also been a lesson in making members of the imperial house very, very angry. All right, so there's religion here, but there's also a whole lot of politics at work. All right, but basically how it shakes out is Nestorius was from Antioch, but he was elevated to the Patriarch of Constantinople, okay, which was an incredibly powerful position. And he argued that Mary could not be called the God-bearer, all right? At most, she could be called the Christ-bearer. Alexandria and Constantinople were very upset about this. All right. One of the other big political issues here is Nestorius and the empress in the east, whose name was Pulcharia. She was a very, very influential woman, were feuding through this whole time. Nestorius had a very low opinion of women, which probably was also influencing his theology here around Mary. And just to give you an idea what kind of his relationship with the empress, they had an exchange where she was very, very like overtly pious, all right? And he refused to let her into a Vespers service, okay, because she was a woman. And she says, "Have I not given birth to Christ?" And he replies, "You have given birth to Satan." And basically he's, saying that all women are fallen like Eve, okay? All right, I want to take a minute just to talk about this issue of the Theotokos, or the God-bearer, and why this became such a fight, and why people reacted so strongly to Nestorius. Number one, it has to do with the kind of nature of Jesus, okay? He's trying to separate the human part of Jesus from the divine part of Jesus, okay? So when he says Mary isn't the God-bearer, she's just the Christ-bearer, it's like, well, she gave birth to Jesus's flesh, but not his godly self, all right? And so that's why people really, really took issue with it. And plus, people loved Mary, all right? Occasionally the leadership would try to sort of clamp down on the Mary devotion. It really never worked, actually kind of still until the Reformation, where you get more reaction against Mary. But in the Catholic Church, in the Orthodox churches, the kind of churches of the East, Coptic Church, Armenian Church, Mary has such a position of respect, in the Catholic Church, the Queen of the Heavens, the second, the new Eve, all right? So that is why it's such a big deal. It's both the theological piece, but also the devaluing of the Virgin Mary that we see in these claims. All right, let's talk about the Council of Chalcedon. In a sense, Chalcedon is just a continuation of the previous fight about the nature of Jesus, okay? But this is where we get the definition of Chalcedon. All right, so in this council, Mary is explicitly called the Theotokos, all right? And then we get this definition of Chalcedon, which says Jesus is one person in a union of two natures. He is without confusion and change for the Antiochians, and without division or separation for the Alexandrians. Okay, Canon 28 coming out of the council elevated the Bishop of Constantinople to the same rank as the Bishop of Rome. Obviously, the Western Church did not like this and refused to ever accept it. Nestorius was condemned again, because why not? And then most churches were fine with this definition of Chalcedon, this definition of kind of how Jesus's natures work together. However, the West accepted Canon 28, and then the churches of Syria, Armenia, Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia all actually ended up rejecting Chalcedon in favor of the Alexandrian position of one nature, all right? And that today is known as Miaphysite. They're the Miaphysite Christians, all right? So Jesus having one nature. All right, I'm going to wrap up this video right now. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.